in this discussion. On my right, Bruce Hodgins from Peterborough, Professor Emeritus of History, Trent University. He's active in the Peterborough community the whole time that he's lived there. He was, or maybe still is, a card member of the NDP and actually ran for that party in the 1960s. He is active in promoting canoeing in Peterborough through the museum, and in Canada through canoeing, whitewater canoeing, and I know he's taken groups to the Northwest Territories. And you met him once here before, those of you who follow this program, a debate on the Trent Severn waterway, should it be nominated as a heritage waterway. So the program today is really a continuation of that debate. Property rights are closely related to the debate on the Trent Severn waterway. I'm going to ask our two guests to introduce the topic. I'm going to call on Bob first, and then Bruce second. And I want you each to tell me, first of all, what do we mean by property rights? And the second question is, why should we enshrine them, and why should we not enshrine them in the Constitution? Bob, may I ask you to begin?
Well, to the first question, what are property rights? I think the issue to understand is that property rights does not necessarily mean that you have a right to a particular object. What it means is that you have the right to take the action necessary to earn and acquire that object by peaceable means, and that once having done so, that you have the right to keep, use, dispose of, own and sell and buy and trade whatever it is that you've created. And that inherently is where a property right comes from. Property rights in a society are very important, particularly private property rights, since they allow each person with differing interests to go their own way and not having to have the whole group of people act as a collective. It is an instrument through which we can basically enshrine our right to disagree with one another in a free society, peaceably. On my property, I can set my own rules in terms of what I would want to have happening in my home. But the main thing about property rights is to give to the average citizen some sort of guarantee that he cannot be deprived of his property in any sort of whimsical or arbitrary way by government. And that answers the second part of your question, is why we should have such a right enshrined in the Constitution or in some framework of government that will protect us from the state, which is really the only reason you really need a Constitution, is to protect the individual from the state. So, you know, we all accept property rights to some degree for granted because we've basically lived in a basically free society, but we have no guarantee of that. If the government wanted your house today or wanted your property today, it would just have to pass a law and take it, and through expropriation, any other means. So I guess the issue comes down to what makes those kinds of actions justifiable, and what other issues are involved with property rights. For example, I may own a store, but the municipality I live in may tell me I can only use it for certain purposes. I can only open on certain days. I can only keep certain hours. These all are basically infringements on a property right. And whether they're justifiable or not depends upon other existing contracts, property rights, and situations. But certainly, one of the reasons we have government is to protect our property rights, to enshrine them, to make sure that, you know, when you sign a title deed for your home and somebody wants to contest it, you have some place to go to prove that that is indeed your home. So, you know, as a basic framework, that's where I would say why we need property rights.
Bruce, what do we mean by property rights as far as you're concerned?
I don't dissent at all from what was described in terms of the definition of those rights, or what we're talking about in terms of property. I think we're in agreement on that. But I profoundly disagree with the idea that such rights are absolute, or that such rights need entrenchment. Maybe I go back and to say, if it isn't broken, don't repair it. I might even point out a case decided in the Ontario Supreme Court today that gave the right to secondary boycott in terms of the group of people that were championing the cause of the Lubicon Indians, and they were charged with, in Alberta, they were charged with hurting the lumber company's business by urging people not to buy their products. Now, if in fact property had been, and they allegedly caused a $14 million damage, etc. If in fact we had this entrenchment of property rights, I would suspect that concept of secondary boycott would not stand up, and that the lumber company would have been the winner. I think if you absolutely entrench these powers, you don't protect the individual or the community, but I think you frequently protect the large interest, the international banks, the multinational corporations, etc. I don't think it's a good idea. I think we should absolutely not entrench such rights. It seems to me that as a relative right, these properties are safe under the Canadian version of English common law, and that we don't need nor should we have such rights. In fact, I would even argue that perhaps they're even too strong now for my liking. They can be, of course, those rights can be restricted. There is, as you said, the power of expropriation that can be done. You don't even have to pass a law for that. You have to indicate general societal need and operate under existing statutes. And so the issue when that happens, when government, usually provincial, does such a thing, the important thing is that the person receive due market value compensation, and that they have the right to appeal in the courts. And I think that kind of situation existed. Trent University, for instance, was established through a process of General Electric giving the core amount of money to the company, and the rest the provincial government expropriating 5 or 6 farms and 10 or 12 houses in order to make a property large enough for what was perceived as a societal benefit. I think that was highly legitimate. To constitutionally entrench such rights, it seems to me, would violate the Canadian tradition. A very important one, would be very American, and very much tied into concepts of the late 18th century and at the period of the American Revolution and the American Constitution. Our tradition is a royal one, or a red Tory one if you prefer, that emphasizes land in particular originally being part of a crown domain, and that we receive property which is not an absolute grant. We receive property through a patent. We see property through a crown grant, or we bring it into the country, whatnot. And the only profound expression of that is Aboriginal and treaty rights for Aboriginal people, that these are predicated upon concepts established way back in 1763, before that extreme insistence on the concept of entrenching private property. It would go against, I think, all the traditions of Canada, United Kingdom, Northwestern Europe, and all the countries of the Commonwealth that I can think of, to move that next stage into arguing that this should be some kind of absolute right.
If I can stop you there, Bruce, and I'm sure you have other points to make.
Points, yes.
Well, okay, make them briefly, and then we'll go back to Bob.
Yeah. As a social democrat, I think I would argue that there are many cases when community rights are more important than personal rights, and the question is to make sure that the individual is not harmed and that they have due compensation. The other thing I just want to mention, we can talk about a little later, and that is, I think we've got so many problems in Canada, so many issues that tend to come back toward the Constitution or come back towards settlement, of which Quebec-Canada relations are only one, and Aboriginal-Canada relations are another, and there's so many of them that it seems to me that this one is something like abolishing the monarchy, that we should leave the thing alone. And I don't think, frankly, that it's worth getting into raising a campaign, in all due respect, because I don't think there's a remotest chance that such a thing could pass given the nature of the Canadian political system.
I would disagree in the sense that I think it's the next evolution in the very system you were talking about in terms of particularly the British Commonwealth. If our rights aren't absolute, well, then they're conditional. And that means somebody else is granting those rights to us. And if we don't have those rights on an absolute basis, then what rights do we have? Do we have any rights at all? Can we even call something a right if it isn't absolute in that sense? I don't know what you would mean. What would you use as an example, for example, where the community rights would supersede an individual's right? I can't think of a situation where that might arise.
Well, building a highway through private property. I've talked about the establishment of Trent University. 50 other things. The need to create a particular public building on a particular site, all kinds of things like that. But I disagree really profoundly about that earlier statement. I think that this is a passé idea. It had a bit of emphasis at the period of 1981 and 2 when we got the Charter of Rights.
Enshrining is a passé, yes.
In the Charter of Rights. And it didn't come off. There was an attempt at the last minute in 81 and then in the revisions in 82 to get it entrenched.
But the Charter enshrines nothing.
Nowhere.
The Charter has an overriding clause which would make entrenchment of property rights in the Charter rather a moot point if you can override them with the overriding clause.
The overriding clause was put in at the insistence of several provinces.
Yeah.
Trudeau considers it one of his major failings that override came in. But it is a powerful limitation. Again, no rights are absolute in my view, except the right to your life.
But that's where property rights come from, is from the absolute right to your life.
But property is not that entity. Look, when the move was made just 2 weeks ago in Alberta to pass overriding legislation on the matter of homosexual and gay rights, the power of that not being there was enough to make it possible that nothing happened. And it seems to me that the Charter of Rights is a profoundly important document. It sets out all kinds of rights that the individual and communities have vis-a-vis relationship with one another and vis-a-vis their relationship with the provincial state and with the federal state. And and that in a sense changed our system of government because it made the Supreme Court, etc.
Changed for the better, you're saying, yes. Yes.
I think,
so
on balance, for the better.
For example,
and I think that was a good idea. And that we moved that direction. But I don't want to go any further than that.
In Quebec, we have language laws, for example, that can have a person go to jail for putting an English language sign on his property. Would you consider that a legitimate violation of property rights or a legitimate action of the state in terms of infringing upon that person's
to my knowledge,
rights?
no one's gone to jail.
I'm not sure that it's...
I don't
when
think
it's against the law, you will go.
No.
I'm not sure whether it's quite that far, but it is. I see your point.
Well, in London, Ontario, for example, our own Mark Emery there went to jail for employing people in a store on a Sunday, which was private property.
That was a violation of what was then called the Lord's Day Alliance.
Which was a violation of property rights, which was defeated because it was an illegitimate violation.
Well, I think it was wrong legislation. I agree with you on that. But that's the point is the democratic process works its way through those kinds of
So what you're saying is that rights are ascribed simply from a majority rule process. Whatever the majority says is what you have, and that there is no other way of defining what is an absolute right of an individual.
Not true at all.
Well, that's what you just said.
I did not. I did not say that at all. I said that the democratic process on the issue of the Lord's Day Alliance, Lord's Day Act, worked in the way of abolishing that matter when society moved in the direction of change. That's not just majority rule. I think that the reason Trudeau pushed the concept of the Charter of Rights was for the very reason that you mentioned.
But the majority,
a liberal democracy is defined by the basis of how you deal with your minorities.
The majority did not defeat Sunday shopping laws in Ontario. 2 or 3 individuals who challenged it in the courts defeated it. The laws were changed after they realized that they couldn't keep the thing going that way. You cannot keep putting people in jail and giving them worse fines for opening their store on Sunday than you are giving fines to people like Karla Homolka and real serious criminals. I mean, you're treating people who for the act of, doing business were treated like criminals, and I think the majority supported that. I tell you, we were in the Sunday shopping debate, and generally the majority was in support of Sunday shopping laws, even though they violated private property rights.
I just thought of an example. Let me throw this example to you. This recent case, Michael Stadlander, the chef up in the Collingwood area.
Yes.
There's property, and there's a law which protects, I guess it's the general public, the liquor licensing laws.
I'm completely on the side of the chef.
Yes, I am too, but here we have a case...
Probably all are on the side of the chef.
Is this not a case, though, of property rights versus...
to a degree.
By saying you're on the side of the chef, aren't you really saying that perhaps he has a greater right to do what he wants?
I'm not sure I'm familiar with this case.
Well, this is a case where a chef, one of Canada's top chefs, and his wife have set up a farm where they serve meals, I think, on the weekends, and you book, and they serve you a wonderful farm fresh meal, and you bring your own wine. And 2 bureaucrats bureaucrats were sent in.
It's a sting operation.
Yeah, and they said, we forgot our wine, can we buy some? And he apparently said, no, we can't do that. And then finally he sold them some wine, and they were...
From his own stock.
Yeah, from his own stock. So now he's been taken to court.
Yes.
And
I
being
think all
fined.
three of us, though, are on the side of that. That's my argument is that, and it'll get...
What does it have to say, though, about property rights?
Why would we all agree then, if we're all agreed that this person was treated unfairly?
Well, being treated unfairly, that isn't over yet.
Well, whatever, but on what premise? If not on some fundamental belief that this person has a right to his property and a right to sell what he owns and a right to buy what he wants to buy from other people.
But the point is, we've agreed as a society. I mean, I keep emphasizing relative rights and the democratic process of getting these changed, and they get changed through a process of the courts and through a process of the political.
But nevertheless, even though these rights are being changed through a process, on each side of the process there are people arguing the plus or the minuses of the right. That's what we're here to discuss.
I don't want absolute rights in any case, even if in fact it means that this unfortunate chef loses on this particular ground. He won't in the long run lose. I believe in the process.
You don't believe in your right to life or your right to property?
To life. I don't believe in my absolute right to property.
How can you have a right to life without a right to property? For example, all our rights are dependent upon property rights. Every one. If you don't have property rights, you don't have rights. Freedom of speech. If I cannot use my property, my printing press, my telephone,
Well, you can. That's my point is that we do have property rights, but they're not entrenched.
No, they're not entrenched. And if the government tomorrow decides that my website is a hate language website, they can shut it down.
Yes, they can.
And that should not be allowed.
I would think that they should be allowed.
But I disagree with you there.
Well, see, that's what I say. We disagree on
the point is, your disagreement forces force upon me. My disagreement with you leaves you free to go your own way, and that's where we very much differ in our philosophies. To me, the most fundamental thing in a free society is that we have a right to disagree and a right to go our own separate ways.
No one do not have a right to pollute the airways or the telephone wires with hate literature.
I've been called a hate literature person for saying that Quebec should be treated equally as the rest of the country. Okay?
I think that's wrong, by the way.
Well, again, but that's what would get me labeled that. So you're saying I should be shut up. I shouldn't even be sitting here having this debate with you then.
No.
Because what I'm saying could be easily labeled hate literature by some people.
It could easily be labeled, but it wouldn't stand. You have the rights in court and nothing like that would ever put you in jail.
A guy like Ernst Zundel gets labeled for hate literature because he doesn't believe X number of Jews were killed in the war. That's irrelevant to anybody.
No, it's not irrelevant. That is engaged in denying the existence of one of the worst tragedies.
His website is still up. It's operating.
I know. I would shut it down.
And so you're saying that people that you disagree with, or people that I think his ideas may be crazy and whatever, but that's not the point.
It's a relative right. It's not an absolute right.
So the right is relative to whether you agree with the majority or not.
It has nothing to do with the majority. It has to do with whether it contravenes other principles that we as a society hold dear. Particularly principles that are enshrined in our traditions, traditions that are enshrined in the Charter of Rights and in the Ontario and Canadian Bills of Rights.
Those seem to me to be speech, the press, religion, peaceful assembly. Aren't these basic rights that are being exercised by people who may...
Minimum language rights, multiculturalism, Aboriginal rights, or all kinds of other rights besides the ones you list.
And every one you list is the problem point, is a sore point in this country, is where all the conflict is right where we start defining rights in terms of groups instead of in terms of individuals. See, I happen to believe that no individual under the law is more equal than another. I think they all have to be treated equally.
I think even absolute equality is a fiction that has never been practiced in any
country. Equality in existence, I agree, but under the law,
no. The law,
I want to ask each of you a question. Why did the Americans in 1783 enshrine property rights? Or perhaps I could start with a historian. What was the point there? And
it was one of the fundamental principles of the leaders of the American Revolution that these were natural rights. They were perceived at that particular time. We were into what was called the Lockean dispensation, which emphasized that civilization was predicated upon the concept of private property. And moving from Locke to the Declaration, you talked about life, liberty, and one said, and property, which was the Lockean position it got in the Declaration, the pursuit of happiness, and then in the Constitution.
Does it make any difference today, then?
And was never part of the British tradition, or the Canadian, or the European.
But how does it make, what difference does it make today, Americans versus Canadians, and the enshrinement in the American Constitution and the non-enshrinement?
Well, even in the
How
U.S.,
are Americans
despite
different?
the Constitution, the property is by the court interpretation, a relative one.
So it's not an absolute.
Even though the Constitution implied that it was absolute,
Yes.
court interpretation, creative court interpretation has checked that. But it does mean that it's much harder in the United States to move against private corporate property
What about the
rights.
carrying of firearms? Has that got something to do with that absolute?
I think the carrying of firearms is.
I mean, it's that's
Comes from the right
explicit.
to self-defense.
It's explicitly stated in the U.S. Constitution that one of those property rights in that is the right to carry.
Isn't that a
arms,
problem?
And that is not
But
true in the
to
British
answer your
tradition.
question first, Ray, about
Yes.
why
Yes.
they put property rights in the Constitution was because they learned from the European experience and from experiences around the world that countries that didn't have these kinds of protections just got nowhere. They were always at civil war. There was an absolute monarch or some form of government that didn't allow people to carry on about their own business. And the proof in the pudding is, look at what's happened since the entrenchment of property rights in the States. That's when we've had our explosion of civilization and technology all around the world.
We also had the American Civil War, though.
Oh, absolutely. That was the flaw in the structure of the United States. Nobody's defending slavery by any means. Slaves were left out of the equation, which is why I say, which is why I say all individuals should be equal before and under the law. Again, slavery would fit into your looking of things because that's a separate status.
The slaves never owned property, so they wouldn't.
No, they were property.
They were treated as property, as were women in Canada until 1922 or 3.
Or was that 1919?
Women were not. They were not treated as persons. They were not considered persons under the law.
Now, Bob, one point that Bruce raised is that property rights enshrining in the Constitution would only help the multinational corporations and the big banks. What's your argument to that?
I say there's no difference in a property right between a billionaire and the smallest guy in the street. I mean, if he's earned his money peaceably on a free market, which is generally how one would assume a person in business is making their money, then no one has a right to their earnings. They have a right to invest where they want, put the money where they want, spend it all if they want, reinvest it, reemploy people. That's their choice. It's wealth they created. So it's theirs, and that's what creates the property right. You know, I once had it argued to me with my left-wing opponent in London on Left, Right, and Center. He said, well, you know, property rights are just some convention some guy invented to put his cabin in the woods. And I said, well, yeah, that's right. That's exactly what they are. If you build a cabin, that cabin is yours, and no one else has a right to it. So you have to have some social convention so that other people recognize it's yours.
But
otherwise, you'll have conflict.
Not under our system and not under our Constitution. First of all, he would be a squatter. Second, if he had not got a Crown grant, if he got a Crown grant, he would own that property under the imperium or the radical title of the Crown.
Yes, there were ways of making Crown land. In the United States, they had the Homestead Act and the Homesteader's Principle, where the first person who tilled a piece of land or whatever, there were certain prerequisites, then they owned it. And they owned it by virtue of the labor that they put into it. Yes, we did.
So,
and so that's part of the evolution.
I'm not opposed to property, and I'm not opposed to private property. That isn't the debate, and that would be, to me, be a silly debate for us to engage in this country. We're talking about entrenching
could we have had
the concept of private property absolutely in the Charter of Rights. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about whether property is a good idea or not.
Well, if it's a good idea, what's wrong with putting it
because
in
it is
a Constitution?
All rights come in conflict with other rights that are also desirable, and frequently they are all relative terms, not absolute terms.
I would
to
suggest
entrench them as an absolute term in 1998 or in the next 10 years would do nothing but cause untold havoc and trouble within the country, because it would raise one right beyond all kinds of other competing rights. They have to be taken into account.
You know, by definition, there's no such thing as a competing right. There are competing interests, and that's why we need property rights, is to prevent a competing interest. Suppose there's a competing interest who wants my house. Sorry, it's my house. Now, you're arguing that if he has a strong enough interest and can convince enough of his friends to take my house, he should have a right to it.
I'm not
Or
saying
that
other
I shouldn't
individuals.
have any right to it?
No,
No?
I've never said.
You
such
argue
a
as
thing.
a
So
community
who has the
right.
right to, who has the
Any-
right
any,
to violate
any,
my rights?
Provincial, don't say your rights, I'm not talking about that. There is the right of expropriation done through a legitimate means, and there is a court process and a negotiating process and all kinds of other things. If there is perceived by the provincial government or the federal government a higher community
So
right.
the state has the right to do this?
Yes.
Is what you're saying?
And not to confiscate and not to take, but to expropriate, which is a profoundly different thing. How would 401 or 407 or any of those things ever have been undertaken?
Well, a lot of them may
without
not have been
the
undertaken.
And no, I think, using those examples.
Roads
may
are
not
perhaps not a
include
good
the
example.
railways,
But your
all
Trent
kinds of other
University
things you want
example,
to deal
Trent
with.
University is an example dear to your heart, but I can
Yes.
probably take you to one or two unhappy farmers. whose
You may
life-
do, that's what it said. It would,
See,
I'm
and this
sure
would get
there
us
were.
back to Bob,
We
and
would get
the-
back, and I would say there is a greater social, I would argue.
Yes.
There is a greater social good.
So
And that
those-
can be argued, and
Yes.
if
Well,
in
that's
fact
what we're
it's
here
been
for.
done incorrectly. No, but I've been saying can be
Yes.
argued in
Yes.
negotiations.
Well, if
And
one can argue-
And you cannot take, under our law, you cannot take any property away without due compensation. I'm arguing
I
in
don't think
favor
that's
of the
the issue. I
concept
think
of
that's like me
expropriation.
owning my car and somebody wanting to buy it from me,
Not
but I don't want
somebody.
to, or the government wanting to buy my car, and I don't want to sell it, but they're going to buy it off me anyway, and they're going to give me whatever they think it's worth. I mean,
No,
that
but
just
if you
doesn't
think
sound right to me.
No, it's not what they think it's worth. It's what they're offering in negotiations, and then if not, they say, take this is what we believe it's worth. If you don't like that, then you can challenge that in court.
Then I can challenge it in court, spend
But
a
it's
fortune.
not confiscation. I think it's very important.
And-
But I mean, if he's opposed to all that,
And of course, your argument,
then it's just my point, that I'm opposed to
the
an
car
international
example may not be a
constitution.
good example
No, because
because
it doesn't
your point is
happen.
for higher good.
For higher social
and
good.
I can think of no higher good than protecting the individual's right to property. Every time
No,
we
but see,
violate
we
an individual's right to
disagree.
property, we've created a precedent to to violate someone else's right until it becomes a commonplace thing, where, as in totalitarian countries, where everybody's property
No,
eventually
it's not
confiscated.
totalitarian. This has been done by governments on the moderate right and governments on the moderate left.
we've got 2 minutes left. I'm going to
Oh,
give
boy.
each of you a time, 1 minute to summarize. Let's begin with you, Bruce. Just summarize your argument in 1 minute.
My argument is the system in this area is working. Don't tinker with it. It's a strong right that exists within relative and within controlled limits. Secondly, it seems to be, at this time in our history, a stupid thing to engage in this kind of struggle and stir up further divisions in the country, when, first of all, it cannot be achieved under our political process. It cannot be achieved. We'd have to have every province and and the federal government all ruled by either the Freedom Party or the Reform Party to be
then it
able to
can be
get
achieved.
anywhere
Okay.
to do that.
Okay, Bob, 1 minute to summarize your point of view.
It's absolutely, it's hard to believe someone would agree that private property rights are a very necessary and fundamental basis of a society, and at the same time saying that we shouldn't have any way of enshrining them and no way of protecting them. Certainly when a society collapses, as in a case of war, where you might have a War Measures Act, no rights exist because you're under attack from a foreign source, and that's one of the main reasons I've heard for expropriation. But the expropriation takes place much more silently than we see, and I think one of the biggest things we see, and we haven't touched upon it, is like taxes, for example. There are no limits on taxation. Property taxes are going up all the time until people won't be able to afford their property because they're paying for redistributed wealth programs and things like this. This all relates to private property. It's not just your house on a hill. It's the coat on your back, the car in your garage, the TV in your living room.
Okay, I've got to stop you there. I want to thank you both. I'm sure our audience will agree that we've had a sustained and intelligent debate, and we've ended up as friends, which is always the way we should end up. Thank you both for coming from London, Bob, and Peterborough, Bruce, and I'm sure that this debate will continue. Only begun. Thank you very much for watching.